Kale had always been different, even among a people who prized conformity above all else. Orphaned at a young age when his parents died in a territorial dispute, he had been raised by the pack elders who recognized in him something unusual and potentially valuable. Unlike other Omega wolves who were expected to be submissive and purely domestic, Kale possessed an inner strength that commanded respect even from the alphas. More remarkably, he had been blessed or cursed, depending on one's perspective, with the gift of prophecy. His visions came to him in dreams and waking trances, showing him glimpses of possible futures, warnings of approaching dangers, insights into the hidden motivations of those around him. The pack had learned to value these gifts, even as they feared them. Kale's predictions had saved them from ambushes, helped them avoid natural disasters, and guided them through difficult political negotiations with neighboring territories. But it was not just his prophetic abilities that set Kale apart. He possessed a quiet dignity, an inner fire that refused to be extinguished no matter how much pressure was placed upon him. When the pack elders spoke, others listened out of fear or obligation. When Kale spoke, they listened out of respect. There was something about him that commanded attention, a presence that suggested depths of strength and wisdom that belied his Omega status. It was perhaps inevitable that such a remarkable individual would be fated to someone equally complex and challenging. Rual, heir to the Alpha bloodline and future leader of the Verger pack, was everything traditional werewolf society valued in a leader. He was strong, dominant, politically astute, and absolutely committed to maintaining the purity of their bloodline. He had been groomed from birth to lead the pack into a future where their traditional values would remain unchanged and unchallenged. The revelation of their fated mate bond came to both of them during the same prophetic vision that visited Kale on the night before the full moon ceremony. In his dream, he saw the silver thread that connected their souls, felt the overwhelming pull of recognition that could only mean one thing. They were destined for each other, chosen by the moon goddess herself to be eternal partners. But even as Kale experienced the joy of discovering his fated mate, he also saw the rejection that would follow. His prophetic gift showed him Rual's reaction to their bond, the disgust and fear that would drive the future Alpha to deny what the moon goddess had decreed. The vision was so clear, so devastating, that Kale woke with tears streaming down his face and his heart already breaking for what was to come. The night of bonding arrived with all the ceremony and pageantry that such occasions demanded. The entire pack gathered in the ancient stone circle that crowned their highest peak, their voices raised in songs that had been sung for generations. The air was thick with expectation and spiritual energy as unmated wolves prepared to discover their destined partners. Kale stood at the edge of the circle, his heart hammering against his ribs as he felt the mate bond pulling him inexorably toward Rual. Despite knowing what was coming, he couldn't help but hope that maybe his vision had been wrong. Maybe love would triumph over prejudice. Maybe their destined connection would be stronger than Rual's fear. When the moment came for fated mates to step forward and claim each other, Kale moved with the inevitability of fate itself. The silver thread of their bond became visible in the moonlight, stretching between them like a bridge made of starlight. For just a moment, he saw recognition flicker in Rual's eyes, felt the future Alpha's shock as he realized who his destined mate was meant to be. But then Rual's face hardened with disgust and determination. In front of the entire pack, before witnesses who would carry the story for generations, the heir to the Alpha throne spoke words that would shatter Kale's world. "I will not bind myself to a tainted, unstable Omega with traces of magic corruption," Rual declared, his voice booming across the stone circle. "My bond must be with a pureblood female who can strengthen our bloodline. I break this fate." The words hit Kale like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Around them, the pack fell silent in shock and fascination. Such a public rejection of a fated mate bond was unprecedented, a violation of the most sacred laws of their people. But Rual was the future Alpha, and his word carried the weight of absolute authority. "The old blood must remain pure," Rual continued, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at Kale. "I will not contaminate our lineage with the offspring of a broken Omega whose mind is clouded by mystical delusions." With brutal efficiency, Rual reached out and grasped the silver thread that connected them. The bond fought against the rejection, struggling to maintain the connection that the moon goddess had created. But Rual's will was absolute, his rejection complete. With one sharp motion, he tore their fate apart, the spiritual energy crackling and dispersing like lightning in the mountain air. The pain was beyond anything Kale had ever imagined. It felt like his soul was being ripped in half, like every breath was fire in his lungs and every heartbeat was agony in his chest. The severed mate bond left wounds that went deeper than flesh and bone, spiritual injuries that would never fully heal. He collapsed to his knees in the center of the sacred circle, his body convulsing as the magical feedback tore through him. What followed was systematic humiliation designed to erase every trace of Kale's former status within the pack. The elders stripped him of his clan markings, the tattoos and scars that identified him as a member of the Verger bloodline. They branded him with the Mark of the Broken, a searing symbol that would identify him forever as a rejected Omega, a failed mate, a creature without worth or purpose. "You are no longer Kale of the Verger pack," the chief elder declared as the branding iron burned into his flesh. "You are nothing. You belong nowhere. You have no name, no family, no place among the strong." The physical pain of the branding was nothing compared to the spiritual agony of losing everything he had ever known. His home, his identity, his purpose, his future. All of it was stripped away in a single night because he had been foolish enough to hope that love might triumph over prejudice. They cast him out at dawn, driving him from the territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and the still bleeding brand on his shoulder. As Kale stumbled down the mountain paths he had known since childhood, he could hear the pack's howls echoing behind him, not mourning his loss, but celebrating his removal, as if expelling him had cleansed some contamination from their bloodline. The exile was brutal in ways that Kale had never imagined. Without the support of his pack, without the communal energy that sustained all werewolves, his body began to fail. The severed mate bond had left him with a spiritual wound that refused to heal, draining his strength and making even simple tasks nearly impossible. His prophetic gifts, once so controlled and useful, became chaotic and painful, bombarding him with visions he couldn't interpret or shut out. For weeks, he wandered the borderlands between werewolf territory and human settlements, surviving on whatever he could find or steal. His once proud bearing was broken down by hunger and exhaustion, his careful grooming replaced by the desperate appearance of someone who had been cast out to die. The brand on his shoulder marked him as an outcast to any supernatural being who might see it, while his increasingly feral appearance made humans cross the street to avoid him. It was during one of his attempts to steal food from a human market that Kale's luck finally ran out. The magical hunters who caught him were professionals, specialists in capturing supernatural beings for various purposes. They used silver nets and suppression collars to subdue him, then dragged him to the underground markets of Tarmiz where beings like him were bought and sold like livestock. The magical slave market was a nightmare of suffering and degradation that existed in the shadows beneath the human city. Here, creatures who had been captured, exiled, or desperate enough to sell themselves were displayed for buyers who saw them as nothing more than magical tools to be used and discarded. Kale found himself chained in a cage barely large enough for him to stand, his suppression collar preventing him from accessing his wolf form or his prophetic abilities. For 3 days, he endured the humiliation of being examined by potential buyers who poked and prodded him like livestock, discussing his potential uses as if he were an object rather than a person. Some wanted him for his Omega biology, others for whatever remained of his prophetic gifts. All of them spoke about him as if he were a broken thing that might still have some utility if properly managed. It was on the 4th day that Arian Zer arrived at the market. The demon lord's presence was immediately apparent to everyone in the underground chambers. He moved through the market with the fluid grace of a predator, his dark clothing and pale skin making him stand out among the rough crowd of buyers and sellers. His eyes were the color of polished obsidian, and when he smiled, Kale caught a glimpse of fangs that marked him as something far more dangerous than human. Arian examined the available merchandise with the detached interest of someone who had seen it all before. He paused before several cages, asked questions about various beings' abilities and conditions, but showed no particular interest in any of them until he reached Kale's prison. When their eyes met, Kale felt something he hadn't experienced since his rejection, recognition. Not the overwhelming pull of a mate bond, but something subtler and potentially more complex. Arian studied him with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely comforting, as if he were seeing something that others had missed. "This one," Arian said to the slave dealer, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "What's his history?" "Rejected Omega werewolf," the dealer replied with practiced indifference. "Some kind of magical contamination in his bloodline, which is why his pack cast him out. Still has some prophetic abilities, though they're unstable. Could be useful for a buyer who knows how to handle damaged goods." "Damaged goods," Arian repeated, his tone suggesting he found the description both inaccurate and insulting. "And the brand, Mark of the Broken, means he was formally rejected by his fated mate. Makes him unstable but also more compliant. He won't try to run back to a pack that doesn't want him." Arian nodded as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected. "I'll take him." The transaction was completed with efficient brutality that emphasized Kale's new status as property rather than person. Arian paid the dealer's price without negotiation, then waited while the suppression collar was transferred to his ownership. When the slave dealer offered to include additional restraints or control devices, Arian declined with a shake of his head. "That won't be necessary," he said simply. "He's coming with me voluntarily." It wasn't really a question, but Arian's obsidian eyes found Kale's as if seeking confirmation. The choice, such as it was, seemed to be between going with this mysterious demon or remaining in the slave market to be sold to someone else. After a moment, Kale nodded his acceptance. The journey to Arian's mountain stronghold was unlike anything Kale had ever experienced. They traveled not by conventional means, but through shadow portals that folded space and time, allowing them to cover vast distances in moments. The sensation was disorienting but not unpleasant, like being embraced by darkness that was protective rather than threatening. Arian's palace was a marvel of architecture that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially in some realm of shadow and starlight. Its towers twisted upward like frozen lightning, while its walls seemed to shift and flow when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Gardens of night-blooming flowers surrounded courtyards where fountains sang with voices like distant music. "Welcome to the Shadow Court," Arian said as they passed through gates that recognized his presence and opened without any visible mechanism. "This is your home now, for as long as you choose to remain." The casual mention of choice surprised Kale. In his experience, slaves weren't typically given options about where they lived or how long they stayed. But before he could ask for clarification, they were approached by what was clearly the palace's seneschal, a being of indeterminate species whose primary concern seemed to be the efficient operation of the household. "Prepare quarters in the East Wing," Arian instructed. "Something comfortable with access to the gardens and library, and have the kitchen prepare a proper meal. Our guest looks like he hasn't eaten well in some time." Guest. Not slave, not property, not even servant. Guest. The word hung in the air like a promise, suggesting possibilities that Kale didn't dare hope for. The quarters he was given were beyond anything he had ever imagined. The suite consisted of a bedroom larger than most pack common areas, a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over impossible vistas, and a bathroom that featured what appeared to be a small indoor waterfall. The bed was piled high with furs and silks, while the walls were lined with books in languages both familiar and completely unknown. "The suppression collar," Kale said when Arian lingered in the doorway after showing him to his rooms. "Will you be removing it?" "Do you want me to remove it?" Arian asked, his obsidian eyes studying Kale's face with that same intense attention he had shown in the slave market. Yes," Kale replied, surprised by his own honesty. "It makes everything feel muffled, like I'm experiencing the world through thick glass." Arian nodded and stepped closer, his fingers working at the collar's complex locking mechanism with surprising gentleness. When the device finally clicked open and fell away, Kale gasped as his full senses returned to him in a rush. He could smell the complex layers of scent that marked this place as Arian's territory, could hear the whispered conversations of the palace's many inhabitants, could feel the flows of magical energy that powered the impossible architecture around them. Better? Arian asked, his voice softer than it had been before. Much better, Kale confirmed, rubbing his throat where the collar had chafed. Thank you. You don't need to thank me for basic decency, Arian said, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was not accustomed to gratitude. Rest now. Tomorrow we'll discuss what role you might wish to play in my household. What followed was a period of adjustment that challenged everything Kale thought he knew about demons and their society. He had expected to be worked to exhaustion, used until his abilities burned out, treated as nothing more than a magical tool to be exploited. Instead, he found himself in an environment that was both stimulating and surprisingly respectful. Arian's household was vast and complex, home to dozens of beings from across the supernatural spectrum. There were demons of various types, certainly, but also exiled shapeshifters, refugee vampires, humans with magical abilities, and creatures that Kale couldn't even begin to classify. What they all seemed to have in common was that they had found sanctuary here after being cast out or rejected by their original communities. The work Kale was given was challenging but not overwhelming. Arian wanted him to use his prophetic abilities to help with strategic planning, to provide warnings about potential threats, and to offer insights into the motivations of political rivals. But he was never pushed beyond his limits, never forced to strain his abilities to the point of damage. When his visions became painful or overwhelming, he was given time to rest and recover. More surprising still was the way Arian treated him on a personal level. The demon lord never raised his voice, never used physical intimidation, never demanded more than Kale was capable of giving. When Kale struggled with nightmares about his rejection and exile, Arian quietly arranged for his quarters to be warded against unwanted dreams. When Kale's severed mate bond caused him physical pain, Arian provided healing potions and magical treatments. "You're not what I expected," Kale said one evening as they worked together in Arian's private study, using his visions to help plan the defense of a smaller demon territory that was being threatened by aggressive neighbors. "And what did you expect?" Arian asked without looking up from the maps he was studying. "A master who would use my gifts until they burned out, then discard me when I was no longer useful," Kale replied honestly. "Someone who would see me as a broken thing that might still have some value if properly managed." Arian was quiet for a long moment, his obsidian eyes distant with thought. "I have lived for over 6 centuries, he said finally. "I have seen what cruelty accomplishes, what fear creates, what hatred destroys. I have no interest in perpetuating such things in my own domain. Then why keep servants at all? Why not just rule alone?" "Because," Arian said, his voice softer than Kale had ever heard it, "power without purpose is meaningless. Strength without someone to protect becomes just another form of weakness. I learned long ago that the only way to build something lasting is to surround yourself with people who choose to be there, who contribute their own gifts freely rather than being forced to serve." It was the most personal thing Arian had ever shared with him, and it gave Kale a glimpse of the man beneath the demon lord's carefully controlled exterior. Here was someone who understood rejection, who knew what it felt like to be judged for what he was rather than who he was. The realization created a strange sense of kinship between them, a shared understanding that went deeper than their formal relationship. As the weeks passed, Kale found himself looking forward to their evening work sessions. Arian was brilliant and well-educated, with insights that challenged Kale's understanding of politics, magic, and the supernatural world. More importantly, he listened when Kale spoke, treating his observations and intuitions as valuable contributions rather than dismissing them as the confused thoughts of a damaged Omega. "Your visions are remarkably clear," Arian observed one evening as they worked on interpreting a particularly complex prophecy that had come to Kale in dreams. "I've known other seers, but none with your precision and range. My pack saw them as a contamination," Kale replied, still uncomfortable with praise after a lifetime of being told his gifts were dangerous aberrations. "Your pack were fools," Arian said with quiet conviction. "They cast out their greatest asset because they lacked the wisdom to recognize its value." The words warmed something in Kale's chest that had been cold since his rejection. For the first time since Rual had torn apart their mate bond, he began to feel like maybe there was nothing wrong with him. Maybe the problem had been with those who couldn't see his worth. It was during one of Kale's most intense prophetic episodes that their relationship began to shift into something deeper and more complex. The vision had come to him without warning, overwhelming his senses and leaving him convulsing on the floor of the study as images of possible futures flooded his mind. When he finally returned to awareness, he found himself in Arian's private chambers with the demon lord sitting beside his bed, genuine concern etched across his features. "How do you feel?" Arian asked, his hand cool against Kale's fevered forehead. "Like I've been struck by lightning," Kale replied weakly. "How long was I out?" 6 hours, Arian said, his expression growing more serious. "Kale, the power you channeled during that vision. It was unlike anything I've seen from a prophetic gift. Your abilities aren't just remarkable, they're unprecedented. Is that good or bad?" "It's dangerous," Arian said honestly. "Power like that will attract attention from those who would seek to exploit it. You'll need training, protection, guidance from someone who understands both prophetic magic and the politics of the supernatural world." "Someone like you?" "Someone exactly like me," Arian confirmed. "If you're willing to trust me with something so precious." The offer was more than Kale had dared to hope for. Instead of just being a useful servant whose gifts were exploited until they burned out, he was being offered genuine training and protection. But more than that, he was being offered a chance to develop his abilities to their full potential under the guidance of someone who saw their value. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I trust you." What followed was the most intensive period of magical education Kale had ever experienced. Arian proved to be a patient and knowledgeable teacher, guiding him through techniques that had been developed over centuries of demonic magical practice. But more than that, he encouraged Kale to explore his own unique gifts, to push the boundaries of what prophetic magic could accomplish. Under Arian's guidance, Kale's abilities grew exponentially. He learned to control his visions instead of being overwhelmed by them, to seek out specific information rather than waiting for random prophecies, to shield his mind from the more traumatic aspects of seeing possible futures. The prophetic gifts that had made him an outcast among his own people became the foundation for a magical education that few beings in the world could have provided. But it wasn't just Kale's magical abilities that were growing. His relationship with Arian was evolving in ways that neither of them had expected. The demon lord's cold, controlled exterior was slowly melting away, revealing a man who was capable of great warmth and genuine affection. The way he looked at Kale was changing, becoming softer, more protective, tinged with something that might have been love. For his part, Kale found himself drawn to Arian in ways that went far beyond gratitude or respect. The demon's intelligence fascinated him. His dry humor made him laugh, and his quiet strength made him feel safe in ways he had never experienced. When Arian touched him during their magical training sessions, Kale felt sparks of connection that had nothing to do with prophetic energy. The realization that he was falling in love with his protector was both thrilling and terrifying. Arian had saved him, trained him, given him a purpose and a place in the world. But he was also a demon lord with centuries of experience and power beyond imagination. What could a rejected Omega possibly offer someone like that? The question became more urgent when Kale entered his first heat cycle since arriving at the Shadow Court. The experience was more intense than any he had previously endured, complicated by the trauma of his severed mate bond and the stress of his recent ordeals. He had hoped to handle it alone, using suppressants and isolation to minimize the impact on those around him. But his attempts at concealment failed when the magical feedback from his intensified state triggered a series of violent prophetic visions. He was found convulsing in his quarters, his body burning with fever while his mind was lost in apocalyptic images of possible futures. By the time the palace healers reached him, he was barely conscious and dangerously close to magical burnout. When awareness finally returned, Kale found himself in Arian's private chambers, the demon lord sitting vigil beside his bed, with an expression of profound worry and something deeper that made Kale's heart race despite his weakness. "You tried to handle this alone," Arian said, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and gentle reproach. "Why didn't you tell me what was happening?" "I didn't want to be a burden," Kale admitted, his voice hoarse from the fever. "I didn't want you to see me as just another needy Omega who couldn't control his own biology." "Is that what you think I would see?" Arian asked, his obsidian eyes intense with emotion. "After everything we've shared, after all the trust we've built, you thought I would judge you for something completely natural and beyond your control?" I don't know what I thought," Kale confessed. "I was scared. Scared of being vulnerable, scared of needing someone, scared of what it might mean if you helped me through this." Arian was quiet for a long moment, his hand gentle as he checked Kale's temperature and monitored his recovery. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Kale had ever heard it. "Kale, I need you to understand something. What I feel for you, it goes far beyond the relationship between a lord and his household member. It goes beyond gratitude for your services or appreciation for your gifts. I care for you as a person, as someone whose happiness and well-being matter to me more than my own comfort." The words hit Kale like a revelation, so unexpected and wonderful that he almost couldn't believe them. "You care for me? I care for your courage, your resilience, your incredible gifts that you use to help others rather than seeking power for yourself. I care for the way you see hope where others see only despair. I care for your strength, which is so much greater than you realize." Arian's voice was soft but certain. "I care for you, Kale, and I want to help you through this if you'll let me." "How?" Kale whispered, not daring to hope for what he thought Arian might be offering. "However you need," Arian replied. "I can provide medical support, magical assistance to ease the worst symptoms, or—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Or I can provide more personal comfort, if that's what you want. Not as a master claiming his property, but as someone who cares for you offering whatever help you're willing to accept." The offer was everything Kale hadn't dared to dream of. Not just physical relief from the intensity of his heat, but emotional connection with someone who saw him as precious rather than burdensome. Someone who was offering help without demanding anything in return, who was giving him the choice about how much intimacy he was comfortable with. "I want that," Kale said, his voice barely audible. "I want you to help me. I want you." What followed was the most beautiful and tender experience of Kale's life. Arian approached him with infinite patience and care, focusing entirely on Kale's comfort and pleasure rather than his own needs. He used his centuries of experience not to dominate or control, but to worship and cherish, showing Kale depths of intimacy and connection that he had never imagined possible. Through their physical joining, Kale felt something he had thought was lost forever, the sense of being truly known and accepted by another person. Arian didn't just want his body or his magical abilities. He wanted all of him, the damaged parts as well as the strong ones, the fears as well as the hopes. "You're perfect," Arian whispered against his skin, as they moved together in ancient rhythm. "Everything about you is exactly as it should be." "I'm broken," Kale protested, though the words carried less conviction than they once had. "You're healed," Arian corrected, his hands gentle as they mapped every inch of Kale's body. "You're whole. You're mine if you want to be." "Yours," Kale agreed, the word feeling like a promise rather than a surrender. "Always yours." When the heat finally passed, both of them knew that their relationship had fundamentally changed. They were no longer lord and household member, no longer even just friends. They were partners in every sense of the word, bound together by choice rather than fate, by love rather than obligation. "I love you," Arian said one evening as they sat together in the garden, watching the night-blooming flowers open under the starlight. "I know it's too soon to say it. I know our circumstances are complicated. But I can't keep pretending that what I feel is anything less than complete devotion." "I love you too," Kale replied, his heart full of wonder at being able to speak those words freely. "I've been afraid to admit it, afraid of being hurt again, but I can't deny what's in my heart anymore." "Are you sure?" Arian asked, his expression vulnerable in a way that revealed just how much Kale's answer mattered to him. "Are you sure this isn't just gratitude or relief at being safe? Are you sure you can love a demon someone whose very nature makes him an outcast among most supernatural communities. I'm sure, Kale said firmly, taking Arian's hands in his own. I love your strength and your gentleness. I love your intelligence and your humor. I love the way you've built a sanctuary for beings who don't fit anywhere else. I love you not despite what you are, but because of who you've chosen to be. Their relationship deepened over the following months, built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values that went far beyond physical attraction. They discovered a shared commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, a mutual appreciation for the complexities of magical theory, and a deep understanding of what it meant to be judged for circumstances beyond their control. But their personal happiness was shadowed by growing concerns about the outside world. Reports reached the Shadow Court of increasing persecution of mixed-blood beings, of packs and clans cracking down on anyone who didn't fit traditional categories, of a rising movement that sought to purge the supernatural world of what they called contaminated bloodlines. It's getting worse, Kale said one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports from their various contacts. The Verger Pack isn't the only one adopting these extremist positions. There's a whole network of traditionalist groups that see beings like us as threats to their way of life. And they're not entirely wrong, Arian replied grimly. We are a threat to their way of life. We represent the possibility that their rigid hierarchies and bloodline obsessions are not only unnecessary but actively harmful. What do we do about it? We prepare, Arian said, and we hope that when the conflict comes, and it will come, we're ready to protect the people who depend on us. Their preparations proved prescient when refugees began arriving at the Shadow Court in increasing numbers. Exiled werewolves, displaced shapeshifters, half-blood beings who had been cast out by both sides of their heritage. All of them found their way to Arian's mountain stronghold seeking the sanctuary that had become legendary among the supernatural underground. It was during this influx of refugees that Kale encountered the child who would change his life in ways he never expected. The boy was perhaps 8 years old, a half-dragon whose mixed heritage had made him unwelcome in both draconic and human communities. He had been found wandering alone in the mountains, malnourished and traumatized, speaking in a mixture of ancient draconic and modern human languages that few could understand. What's your name? Kale asked gently, kneeling down to the child's level while they waited for the palace healers to examine him. Zephyr, the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. They said I was wrong, that I shouldn't exist, that my mother should have never what? Kale prompted gently. Should have never loved my father? Zephyr finished, tears streaming down his face. They said love between dragons and humans always produces monsters. The words hit Kale like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his own rejection and the cruel things that had been said about his prophetic gifts. Here was a child who had been told the same lies, who had been made to feel ashamed of his very existence simply because he didn't fit into convenient categories. They were wrong, Kale said firmly, his heart breaking for this frightened child. Love doesn't produce monsters, produces miracles. You're not wrong or broken or shameful. You're exactly who you're supposed to be. Really? Zephyr asked, his large eyes wide with desperate hope. Really? Kale confirmed, pulling the boy into a gentle embrace. And you're safe here. No one will ever tell you that you shouldn't exist again. The decision to formally adopt Zephyr was made jointly by Kale and Arian, though it felt less like a choice than a recognition of something that had already happened. The child had bonded immediately with Kale, seeming to recognize in him someone who understood what it felt like to be rejected for circumstances beyond his control. For his part, Kale felt a fierce protective instinct awaken in him, a paternal love that was both overwhelming and completely natural. We're going to be fathers, Arian said that night as they tucked Zephyr into bed in what had quickly become his permanent room. We are, Kale agreed, his heart full of joy and purpose. And we're going to make sure he knows every day that he's wanted, that he's loved, that his differences make him special rather than wrong. Zephyr proved to be a remarkable child, intelligent and curious despite his traumatic early experiences. His draconic heritage gave him abilities that few beings possessed: limited flight, resistance to magical attacks, and the capacity to understand and speak languages that had been dead for centuries. Under Kale and Arian's careful guidance, he learned to see these gifts as advantages rather than curses. Papa Kale, Zephyr said one evening as they worked together in the garden, using his draconic strength to help move heavy stones while Kale used his prophetic abilities to determine the best placement for new plantings. Why do some people think being different is bad? Because they're afraid, Kale replied, watching with pride as his adopted son carefully positioned a boulder that would serve as the centerpiece for a new flower bed. They're afraid of things they don't understand, afraid of change, afraid of admitting that maybe their way isn't the only way. But being different is what makes us special, right? Right? Kale confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. Being different gives us unique perspectives, special abilities, the capacity to see solutions that others might miss. Like how you can see the future and Papa Arian can travel through shadows? Exactly like that, Kale said with a smile. And like how you can fly and speak ancient languages. Your differences aren't problems to be solved. They're gifts to be celebrated. As Zephyr grew and thrived under their care, Kale and Arian began to realize that their little family had the potential to be something even greater. Other refugees and outcasts were finding their way to the Shadow Court, drawn by stories of a place where differences were celebrated rather than condemned. They were accidentally creating a community, a sanctuary, a new model for how supernatural beings could live together. We should formalize this, Arian said one evening as they watched Zephyr playing with several other young outcasts who had found their way to the palace. Create an official refuge, a place where beings like us can learn to use their gifts without fear of persecution. A school, Kale mused, the idea taking shape in his mind. A place where mixed heritage beings can learn about all aspects of their nature, where different traditions can be studied and combined, where cooperation is valued over competition. You like the idea? I love it, Kale said, leaning into Arian's embrace. I love the idea of turning our personal happiness into something that can help others find their own paths to acceptance and belonging. The establishment of what they called the Sanctuary of Shadows was a massive undertaking that required months of planning and preparation. They needed to create educational programs that would serve students from dozens of different supernatural traditions, find teachers who could work with beings whose gifts varied wildly, and establish a governance structure that would allow their diverse community to function peacefully. But the most important aspect of the sanctuary was its founding philosophy, which Kale and Arian developed together based on their own experiences of rejection and redemption. The core principle was simple but revolutionary. Every being had inherent worth that was not dependent on their ability to conform to traditional expectations. Differences were not problems to be solved, but gifts to be nurtured. Love was more powerful than fear, acceptance more valuable than dominance, cooperation more effective than competition. The sanctuary opened its doors 2 years after Kale's arrival at the Shadow Court, and the response was overwhelming. Students arrived from across the supernatural world, young vampires who had been cast out for showing too much empathy, werewolves whose gifts didn't fit traditional roles, shapeshifters with unusual abilities, and beings of mixed heritage who had never found acceptance in pure-blood communities. Look at what we've built, Arian said one evening as they stood on the balcony of their private quarters, watching students from dozens of different species working together in the gardens below. When I first found you in that slave market, I never imagined we would create something like this. When I was cast out from my pack, I thought my life was over, Kale replied, his hand finding Arian's and intertwining their fingers. I thought I would die alone and forgotten, that my gifts would be wasted, that I would never find love or purpose or belonging. And now I know that sometimes our greatest disasters become our greatest blessings, Kale said, turning to face the demon he loved with all his heart. If Rual hadn't rejected me, I never would have found you. If I hadn't been enslaved, I never would have discovered my true potential. If we hadn't been forced to fight for our right to exist, we never would have created this sanctuary for others. The rejected Omega and the Shadow Demon, Arian said with a smile that held centuries of love and devotion. Not exactly the most likely pair to change the world. The best love stories never are, Kale replied, standing on his toes to kiss his mate. The best love stories are about finding someone who sees your worth when no one else can, who believes in your dreams when they seem impossible, who stands by your side when the whole world tells you you're wrong. But their happiness was shattered one autumn morning when scouts brought word that the Verger pack was mobilizing for war. Led by Rual, now fully grown into his role as Alpha, they had formed an alliance with other traditionalist groups and were marching on the Shadow Court with the stated goal of destroying what they called the contamination of pure bloodlines. "They're calling it a holy war," the scout reported, his voice grim with the implications. "They claim that mixed heritage beings and interspecies relationships are corrupting the supernatural world, weakening the pure bloodlines that have kept their species strong for millennia." "How many?" Arian asked, already shifting into tactical mode. "Several hundred," the scout replied. "Multiple packs, 3 vampire covens, at least 2 dragon clans, and a contingent of pureblood demons who see your sanctuary as a threat to traditional hierarchies." "We can't fight that many," Kale said, his prophetic abilities already showing him glimpses of the devastation that would result from open warfare. "Even with all our defenses, even with our students and refugees fighting alongside us, we're outnumbered 3 to 1. "Then we don't fight," Arian said, his expression thoughtful. "We do something they won't expect." "What do you mean?" "We invite them in," Arian said, his obsidian eyes gleaming with the kind of strategic brilliance that had made him legendary among demonkind. "We open our doors, show them what we've built, force them to confront the reality of what they're trying to destroy." It was a dangerous gamble, but it was also their best hope for avoiding a war that would destroy everything they had built. Over the following weeks, they prepared not for battle but for the most important diplomatic mission of their lives. Instead of weapons and defensive spells, they armed themselves with demonstrations of their community's achievements, testimonials from their students and refugees, and evidence of the innovations that had emerged from their diverse population. When the Verger Alliance arrived at their borders, Kale made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of meeting them with negotiators or remaining safely within the sanctuary's defenses, he chose to go out and face them personally. Not as a cowering exile begging for mercy, but as a leader in his own right, someone who had built something worth defending. "You don't have to do this," Arian said as they prepared for what could be their final goodbye. "I can handle the negotiations. You don't owe them anything." "Yes, I do," Kale replied, his voice steady with conviction. "I owe it to every student who's found acceptance here, every refugee who's discovered their worth, every child who will grow up knowing that their differences make them special rather than shameful. I owe it to them to show that love really can triumph over fear." The kiss Arian gave him was fierce and desperate, full of love and terror and the promise of reunion. "Come back to me," he whispered against Kale's lips. "Whatever happens out there, come back to me. Always," Kale promised. And then he was walking toward the Alliance lines, toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everything he held dear. The Verger pack had assembled in the valley below the sanctuary, their numbers so vast that they seemed to darken the very landscape. At their head stood Rual, now fully grown into his role as alpha and leader of the Traditionalist Alliance. He looked older, harder, with lines around his eyes that spoke of difficult decisions and heavy responsibilities. When he saw Kale approaching, his expression was unreadable. "Kale of no pack," Rual called out, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. "You stand accused of corrupting the pure bloodlines, of promoting unnatural unions, of building a sanctuary for abominations that threaten the stability of all supernatural communities. Have you come to surrender?" "I have come to offer you a choice," Kale replied, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "You can destroy us, tear down what we've built, continue the cycle of fear and hatred that has defined supernatural politics for centuries. Or you can see what we've actually created, judge us by our actions rather than your assumptions, and discover that cooperation produces stronger communities than conflict ever could." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled alliance. This was not the broken, pleading exile they had expected to find, but a confident leader who spoke with authority and conviction. "You admit to harboring abominations," another alpha accused. creatures who should never have been born, relationships that violate the natural order. I admit to providing sanctuary for beings who were cast out for being different, Kale corrected. I admit to creating a community where love is more important than bloodline purity, where cooperation is valued over dominance, where every individual is seen as precious regardless of their heritage. And what has this cooperation achieved? Rual demanded, his voice carrying skepticism and challenge. What has your mixing of bloodlines produced besides weakness and contamination? Instead of answering with words, Kale began to demonstrate. He called upon his prophetic abilities not to attack or defend, but to show the Alliance leaders' visions of what their communities could become. He showed them innovations in magic that had emerged from combining different traditions, new forms of healing that drew on multiple supernatural lineages, solutions to problems that pure-blood communities had struggled with for centuries. This is what cooperation produces, he said as the visions faded, leaving the Alliance members shaken by what they had seen. Not weakness, but strength. Not contamination, but evolution. Not the destruction of your traditions, but their expansion into something greater. Tricks and illusions, Rual said, but his voice lacked conviction. Pretty lies meant to distract us from the fundamental truth that mixing bloodlines leads to the degradation of all involved. Then come see for yourself, Kale challenged. Come to the sanctuary. Meet our students. Observe our methods. Judge our results with your own eyes, rather than relying on prejudice and assumption. What followed was perhaps the strangest siege in supernatural history. Instead of attacking the sanctuary, the Alliance found themselves reluctantly accepting Kale's invitation to witness what had been built there. Small groups began to separate from the main force, approaching the mountain stronghold with mixtures of suspicion and curiosity. What they found challenged every assumption they had brought with them. Instead of the chaotic madness they expected from mixed bloodlines, they discovered a thriving community where beings from different traditions worked together seamlessly. They saw innovations in magic and technology that surpassed anything their segregated communities had achieved. They met students who embodied the best qualities of multiple heritages rather than the worst of any. But perhaps most importantly, they met Zephyr. The 12-year-old half-dragon had grown into a confident young man whose unique abilities made him an ideal ambassador for everything the sanctuary represented. He could speak to the dragon clan members in their ancient language, could demonstrate shape-shifting techniques to the werewolf alphas, could discuss magical theory with the vampire lords, all while maintaining the kind of innocent enthusiasm that made it impossible to see him as a threat. "You see me as an abomination," he said during one of the formal presentations, his young voice clear and strong. "A mixing of bloodlines that shouldn't exist. But I am living proof that love creates strength, not weakness. I can fly like my dragon ancestors and think like my human grandmother. I can speak languages that have been dead for centuries and understand technologies that didn't exist when those languages were alive. I am not less than what I could have been. I am more." The impact of his words was visible throughout the Alliance. Here was a child who embodied everything they claimed to oppose, yet who spoke with more wisdom and maturity than many of their own leaders. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could something they had been taught to see as wrong produce results that were so clearly right? It was Rual who finally asked the question that had been haunting him since he first saw Kale again. "Why?" he said during a private moment when the formal presentations had ended. "Why did you choose this path? Why didn't you just find another pack, another community that would accept you?" "Because," Kale replied, his voice filled with compassion rather than accusation, "I learned that being rejected by one community doesn't mean you're worthless. It means you need to find a different community or build one yourself. I learned that love is not a finite resource that gets weakened by sharing it widely. I learned that strength comes not from purity but from unity." "I was wrong," Rual said suddenly, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. "I was wrong to reject you, wrong to cast you out, wrong to see your gifts as contamination rather than blessing. I was afraid, Kale, afraid of what accepting you would mean, afraid of what my pack would think, afraid of appearing weak." "I know," Kale said, his empathic abilities allowing him to feel the depth of Rual's regret and self-recrimination. I can feel your pain, your guilt, your realization of what you lost. But I can't undo what happened, Rual. I can't pretend that the rejection didn't shape me, that the exile didn't change me, that I haven't found something better than what we might have had. The demon, Rual said, his voice heavy with understanding. You love him. I do, Kale replied without hesitation. I love him completely and utterly, and he loves me the same way. He sees me for who I truly am, values my gifts, supports my dreams, and makes me feel like the most precious thing in his world. And the child? The half-dragon. My son, Kale said with fierce pride. Arian and I adopted him when no one else would take him in. We're raising him to know that his differences make him special, that love comes in many forms, that family is about choice rather than blood. Rual was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. Then you won't return to us? You won't consider rebuilding what we once had? No, Kale said firmly but kindly. That chapter of my life is closed. But I'm not here to gloat or to seek revenge. I'm here to offer you the same choice I offered your alliance. You can continue to see difference as threat, change as contamination, love as weakness. Or you can open your minds to the possibility that strength comes from unity, that cooperation produces better results than competition, that the future belongs to those who can adapt rather than those who cling to the past. The debate that followed lasted for days, with alliance members arguing passionately on both sides. Some remained committed to their traditionalist positions, unable to accept that their fundamental assumptions might be wrong. Others had been genuinely moved by what they had witnessed at the sanctuary and were beginning to question whether their rigid hierarchies were serving their communities well. In the end, it was the younger generation that provided the decisive factor. Young alphas and omegas from various packs stepped forward to speak about their own struggles with traditional expectations, about friends who had been cast out for being different, about innovations that had been suppressed because they didn't fit conventional categories. We're losing our future, one young omega said, his voice shaking with emotion. We're so focused on maintaining the past that we're not preparing for what's coming. The world is changing, and we need to change with it or be left behind forever. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. By a narrow margin, the alliance chose to begin the process of change, to start questioning their traditional assumptions about purity and strength. It wasn't a complete victory for Kale's vision, but it was a beginning. More importantly, nearly half of the alliance members chose to remain at the sanctuary or to return to their home territories with plans to establish similar integrated communities. These beings had seen something in the Shadow Court that spoke to needs they hadn't even realized they possessed. The need for acceptance of their complete selves, the need for communities built on choice rather than mere circumstance of birth, the need for relationships that transcended traditional boundaries. As the remaining traditionalists prepared to depart, Rual approached Kale one final time. The former alpha looked older, more tired, but also somehow more human than Kale had ever seen him. I want you to know, Rual said quietly, that not a day has passed since I rejected you that I haven't regretted it, not because of your power or your achievements, but because I lost the chance to know you, to learn from you, to grow alongside you. I know, Kale replied, his prophetic abilities allowing him to feel the sincerity of Rual's regret. And I forgive you, not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger would only poison the life I've built. Will you ever visit? Come back to see how we're changing. Perhaps, Kale said diplomatically. If your changes prove genuine, if you truly create communities where beings like me can find acceptance, then maybe someday we can be allies rather than enemies. Rual nodded, accepting the conditional nature of Kale's forgiveness with grace that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Be happy, he said finally. Be happy. And know that seeing your success has given me hope that redemption is possible even for those who have made terrible mistakes. The journey back to the sanctuary was filled with reflection and relief. Kale had faced his past and emerged stronger for it, had confronted his former pack and offered them a choice between fear and growth. Not everyone had been ready to accept his message, but enough had been moved by his example to begin the process of change. Arian was waiting at the gates, his face anxious until he saw Kale approaching safely. The reunion was emotional and intense, both of them acutely aware of how much they had risked and how much they had to lose. "How did it go?" Arian asked, pulling Kale into his arms with desperate relief. "Better than I feared, not as well as I hoped," Kale replied, breathing in the familiar scent of his beloved. "But it's a beginning, and sometimes beginnings are all we can ask for." "And us? Are we safe?" "We're safe," Kale confirmed. "More than that, we're free. Free to build the future we want, free to love without fear, free to show the world that there's another way." Zephyr came running out to greet them, now old enough to understand the significance of what had just happened. "Papa Kael, did you really face down all those alphas by yourself?" "I faced them with love," Kale corrected, scooping his son into a fierce embrace. "I faced them with the knowledge that what we've built here is worth defending, that our family is worth fighting for, that love really can triumph over fear." "Does this mean we won?" Zephyr asked. "This means we survived," Arian said, joining their family embrace. "We survived, and we proved that our way of living is not only possible but preferable. We showed them that cooperation produces better results than conflict, that love creates strength rather than weakness." That night, as they celebrated their diplomatic victory with the entire sanctuary community, Kale reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. From the broken Omega who had been cast out in shame to the respected leader who had helped broker peace between opposing forces. From the lonely exile who thought he would die forgotten to the beloved partner and father who had found his place in the world. "No regrets?" Arian asked as they stood together on their balcony, watching their students and refugees celebrating in the gardens below. "No regrets," Kale confirmed, leaning into his mate's embrace. "Not about the rejection, not about the slavery, not about any of the pain that brought us together. All of it was necessary to bring us to this moment, to this life, to this love." "And the future?" "The future?" Kale said, watching Zephyr dance with children from a dozen different species, all of them laughing together as if their differences were just interesting variations rather than barriers to friendship. "The future looks bright. We've planted seeds that will grow long after we're gone, created something that will outlast us both." 5 years later, those seeds had grown into a forest of change that stretched across the supernatural world. The Sanctuary of Shadows had become the model for dozens of similar communities, places where mixed heritage beings could find acceptance and where different traditions could be studied and combined. The innovations in magic, governance, and social organization that emerged from these diverse populations had revolutionized supernatural society. Kale and Arian's relationship had deepened into something that transcended the traditional categories of mating bonds or marriage contracts. They had chosen each other freely and continued to choose each other daily, building a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger for it. "They burned me to ashes," Kale said one evening as they sat together in their garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Zephyr was now 17, preparing to establish his own sanctuary in a distant territory where his unique heritage would allow him to serve as an ambassador between dragon and human communities. "And from those ashes you learned to become fire," Arian completed, the words having become something of a family motto over the years. "We learned," Kale corrected, taking his mate's hand in his own. "We learned together. You showed me how to transform pain into strength, rejection into acceptance, exile into homecoming. You showed me how to transform isolation into connection, fear into love, power into service," Arian replied. "We saved each other." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their sanctuary settled into its evening routines. Students from across the supernatural spectrum shared meals and stories, worked together on projects that would have been impossible in segregated communities, formed friendships and partnerships that crossed every traditional boundary. And at the heart of it all were Kale and Arian, the rejected Omega and the shadow demon who had found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful together. Their love story had become more than just a personal triumph. It had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt different, cast out, or alone. Their story reminded the world that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the deepest pain, that sometimes what we think is our ending is actually our beginning, and that sometimes the people who reject us do us the greatest favor of all by freeing us to find where we truly belong. In the end, that was their greatest gift to the world. Not just the sanctuary they had built or the students they had taught, but the simple demonstration that love, given freely and received gratefully, could indeed transform the world. One heart at a time, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, until love became the rule rather than the exception. They had been burned to ashes by rejection and betrayal, but from those ashes they had learned to become fire. Not the destructive kind that consumes everything in its path, but the warming kind that brings light to dark places and makes life possible even in the coldest wilderness. It was a love story worth telling, a life worth living, and a legacy worth leaving. The proof that sometimes the most broken among us have the greatest capacity for healing, both ourselves and others.